The Vatican press hall was no stranger to applause, but on this particular morning, the air pulsed with something far colder than reverence. It was the kind of silence that follows a provocation, a charged quiet that dares someone to respond. Every seat was filled. The cameras were fixed. And at the center of it all sat Pope Leo XIV, flanked by centuries of tradition, his white garments glowing softly under the scrutiny of 1,000 lenses. Across from him sat Julian Cross. He was younger than most in the room, yet his reputation towered. A man made not by faith but by fire, of headlines, of controversy, of takedowns that left religious figures scrambling to defend their relevance in a world Julian insisted had outgrown them. With his signature smirk and an aura sharpened by skepticism, Julian had flown to Rome not for diplomacy, but for a dismantling. And he had chosen his weapon carefully, age. He leaned forward, voice crisp, and asked the question that turned the temperature of the room on its side. "Your Holiness," he began, "what exactly do you gain by telling people over 65 that God still has a purpose for them?" A few heads lifted. A journalist dropped her pen. Julian didn't blink. He continued. "You're speaking to men and women whose bodies are failing. Whose careers are gone. Many of them are alone, counting pills more than dreams. Isn't it misleading, cruel, even? To offer divine intention where there's only decline?" He sat back, arms folded. He expected a soft deflection. Maybe a warm parable, a tired smile, a few vague words about legacy and prayer. He'd seen it before. But Pope Leo didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He looked directly at Julian, not with offense, but with a calm that belonged to someone who had outlived bullets, betrayals, and buried friends. And then, he answered. "Hope," the Pope said slowly, "is not something I offer the old. It's something the old have carried through every war, every funeral, every silence from heaven." Julian shifted slightly. Pope Leo's voice did not rise, but it filled the room with something ancient and unshakable. When a man reaches 65 and is still alive, still breathing, still waking to morning light, that is not biology. That is mercy. That is calling. That is God refusing to sign the final chapter. A hush swept through the room. You could hear chairs stop creaking. You could hear producers stop whispering in earpieces. Even the soft mechanical hum of the camera seemed to step back in reverence. Julian said nothing. The Pope leaned forward. "You speak of decline," he said. "I speak of appointment." And just like that, the confrontation that was meant to humiliate a spiritual relic became a moment that exposed something far more uncomfortable. The emptiness of a world that forgets the value of those who have already survived it. But what he said next silenced the room. And it will do more than silence you, it will force you to confront the one question you've tried to avoid. Why are you still alive? Before we continue, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This isn't a story to observe. It's one to wrestle with. Still breathing? Then that's not random. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory. But if you won't, if this breath means nothing to you, go to the comments and explain why. Because silence, at this point, is a kind of answer. Pope Leo XIV had lived through 6 decades of priesthood, 4 papal conclaves, and 3 assassination attempts. He had knelt beside plague victims in Madagascar, fed starving orphans in war-torn Syria, and once delivered mass with a fractured rib after his convoy had been attacked on a mission of peace. His eyes carried the weight of nations, but his voice had never lost its gentleness. At 84, he no longer walked with ease, but when he entered a room, even silence made room for him. He had not always been Pope. Once, he was just Father Leo, the priest who carried a shovel more often than a scepter. The one who buried bodies with his bare hands during the cholera outbreak in Bogota because the gravediggers had all fled. He was not elected for power, but for presence. And presence was something no one could fake. Now he sat beneath the towering seal of St. Peter, his wrinkled hands folded, his breathing deliberate. The press event was meant to be a moment of gentle inspiration. The Vatican had titled it, Faith After Retirement, a pastoral initiative meant to uplift the elderly in a world that often treated them as burdens. But the room had shifted. The atmosphere was no longer pastoral, it was political, confrontational, almost judicial. And across from him sat the man responsible for that shift, Julian Cross. Julian had made his name not through journalism but through demolition. Faith leaders. Moral figures. Social icons. No one had proven safe once he took aim. His documentaries had gone viral, not for their accuracy, but for their ability to expose cracks, real or perceived, in the institutions people still clung to. He was not hateful, but he was ruthless. His questions were blades, carefully polished and perfectly timed. His suits were sharp, his voice sharper. He had the charisma of a prophet but none of the burden of belief. For Julian, this wasn't just another assignment. It was a symbolic hunt. A public test of whether the world's most revered moral figure could survive a direct, unfiltered interrogation. And if Pope Leo fell, then perhaps the rest of the church would fall with him, one quietly shamed elder at a time. The stage had been set inside the apostolic palace, a space bathed in gold and centuries of conviction. Cardinals lined the walls in silence. Assistants stood nervously beside sound engineers and broadcast teams. The event was being streamed live in 7 languages. Tens of millions were watching, many of them elderly, many of them alone, many of them clinging to the fragile thread of purpose in their final stretch of life. The stakes were not small. And the contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, a man who had buried friends, outlived enemies, and found strength in humility. On the other, a man who had never known surrender, whose pride was weaponized into performance, and whose confidence came not from what he had suffered, but from what he had avoided. Julian adjusted his lapel and glanced at the studio clock. He was calm, rehearsed. Every gesture, every word, designed to chip at the pedestal the Pope had stood on for decades. He wasn't here to seek truth. He was here to draw blood. But what he hadn't accounted for, what no one ever accounts for, is that truth doesn't bleed. It endures. If you think your best years are behind you, you've already surrendered. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory if you know breath still carries purpose. But if you're ready to fade quietly, explain to us in the comments what's left to live for. And let your silence speak louder than your doubt. Julian adjusted his seat, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest, a tell not of nervousness, but strategy. He smiled, the way one does before a courtroom cross-examination, before a carefully planned unraveling. His tone was measured, laced with a professional courtesy that barely masked his intent. Your Holiness, he began, many admire your compassion, your commitment to the elderly. But I'd like to understand. Why do you believe that people beyond the age of 65 still carry divine purpose? The room, already quiet, leaned further inward. Pope Leo didn't speak immediately. He looked at Julian, not as an adversary, but as a student who had just asked the right question without knowing it. Then, he replied with the softness of a father and the precision of a surgeon. When a tree no longer bears fruit, he said, we do not cut it down. We sit beneath it. For shade, for memory, for wisdom that does not grow in spring, but settles in the soil through winter. Julian smiled faintly, unimpressed. But isn't that just a metaphor, Your Holiness? People want meaning, not poetry. And you're telling them, these aging, often lonely people, that God still has plans for them. Isn't that wishful thinking? Pope Leo's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a depth of seeing that reached beyond the question. Do you know who taught me forgiveness? He asked. A 78-year-old widow in Lebanon. She had lost her husband in a bombing, her son to vengeance, and still she washed the feet of the man who had once belonged to the group responsible for their deaths. He paused, allowing the silence to settle. She said, "If I'm still here, I must still serve." Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't expected a direct anecdote. His posture stiffened slightly, like a swordsman realizing his opponent was not unarmed after all. Still, he pressed on. "But aren't you giving people false hope? Many of them are sick, some bedridden. They aren't going to start movements or change nations. What kind of purpose is that?" Pope Leo nodded, his voice even gentler now. "Not every flame is meant to ignite a revolution. Some are kept alive, simply to keep a single room from going cold. I have seen grandmothers in South Sudan whisper psalms over malnourished children. I have seen old men in wheelchairs pray for the nurses who sponge their wounds. You call that small?" Julian shifted in his seat again. "I'm just suggesting, you're suggesting," the Pope interrupted calmly, "that purpose must be loud to be real. But the quiet ones, those who rock grandchildren to sleep, who kneel when no one is watching, who still forgive despite failing bodies, they carry the weight of eternity in their breath." A subtle hush fell again. The press room light seemed warmer now, softer. Julian glanced briefly toward the floor, and for a moment, just a flicker, his certainty cracked. The back and forth continued, but the tone had already begun to shift. Julian's next question came with less edge, more curiosity. Pope Leo didn't seize the shift. He simply responded the way he always had, with clarity, with lived truth, and with a humility that made arrogance feel hollow by comparison. "If you're over 65 and unsure why you're still alive, maybe this video is the reason. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory if you still believe breath carries assignment. And if you're afraid to find out why you're still here, speak your fear in the comments. We read them all. Even the silent ones." Julian's fingers curled subtly around the edge of his notepad. His voice, once poised and tactical, now sharpened with irritation disguised as inquiry. "With respect, Your Holiness," he said, "isn't it delusional, perhaps even dangerous, to keep telling the elderly that their lives still carry divine purpose? Aren't you, in fact, feeding them fantasies because the truth would be too cruel to say aloud?" He leaned back as if granting the Pope space to explain himself, but it was not a question, it was a blow. And he expected it to land. But Pope Leo did not recoil. He straightened, not in defiance, but in remembrance. His voice changed. No longer the soft melody of parables, but the steady cadence of a man who had walked where cameras didn't follow. "I once held the hand of a man dying of gangrene in a Kenyan refugee camp," he said. "His skin had turned black from infection, and no medicine could reach him in time. He couldn't speak. But he wept as I whispered scripture over him. He could not remember his name, but when I said the name of Jesus, he smiled." A silence pressed against the walls. The Pope continued. "In Cambodia, a blind woman, 91 years old, spent her last 3 years praying for the children of her village by name. Every single one. Her bones ached. She could barely eat. But every morning, she sat on a straw mat and asked God to protect the future she would never see." Julian shifted in his seat, but the Pope did not release him. "In Serbia, an old man walked 5 kilometers every Sunday with a limp and a cane just to kneel for 5 minutes during Mass. When I asked him why he didn't stay home, he said, 'Because God hasn't stayed home from me.'" Julian's jaw tightened. The Pope's eyes met his, unwavering. "You think I speak of delusion. But I have seen the dying heal the living with nothing but their faith. I've seen a 70-year-old woman feed 12 children from a garden no one believed could grow. I've watched an 83-year-old priest hold the hands of prisoners younger than his grandchildren, and call them sons." His voice softened, deadlier than shouting. "The world doesn't retire souls. It buries them early." The contrast was now unbearable. Julian's facts felt flimsy next to wounds that had names. His data dissolved in the face of memory and soil and graveyards that still wept with meaning. If you're listening and you've got stories buried under the weight of age and silence, don't let them die with you. You've got wisdom to give. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory, before time convinces you you've already said enough. Or leave a comment and explain to the world why you'd rather fade out than be remembered. Julian inhaled, sharp and quick. His next question came harder, less veiled. So what you're really saying, is that you'd rather let people believe a fantasy, rather than face the reality of decline. Is that it? Give them emotional comfort. Let them pretend they're still useful. Isn't that manipulation, Your Holiness? The accusation rang out louder than his tone. Even the lights seemed to burn hotter in that moment. And still, Pope Leo did not blink. He rose, not suddenly, but with a steady resolve, like stone becoming breath. The room leaned with him. I've buried the forgotten, he said. Not just the elderly, not just the poor. I've buried the faithless. The bitter. The brilliant who died full of applause but empty of peace. And I have sat by the bedside of those who had nothing left but a whisper. And do you know what I heard, over and over, as they clung to the final hour? He paused. I should have loved more. The audience stilled. No sound, no cough, no rustling of paper. Time bowed its head. The Pope's voice deepened. You call it manipulation to offer meaning to the elderly. I call it sacred to remind them that heaven does not forget the old. He stepped toward Julian, not aggressive, but present. You speak of emotional comfort as if it were a drug. I offer it as a mirror. Because nothing is more painful than truth that comes too late. He looked out over the room. Over the millions watching. If breath still fills your lungs, then you are still being written. The blow had landed, not on Julian, but on everyone who had once thought themselves past their worth. The very air in the room felt different, charged not with electricity, but eternity. If your parents or grandparents are still alive, and you think this message is only for strangers, you're wrong. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory, and honor the breath that still wakes them. Or drop your thoughts in the comments section, if you truly believe their time means nothing. We dare you. Julian did not speak. Not yet. His eyes wandered to the floor, as though searching for solid ground beneath the sudden tide that had risen in the room. The rhythm in his voice was gone, and with it, the unshakable composure he had worn like armor since he entered. Pope Leo remained standing, but his tone softened, not in retreat, but in mercy. You are not cruel, he said gently. Only afraid. Julian's gaze lifted, uncertain. The Pope continued. You fear their future, he said, motioning toward the idea of the aged, the forgotten, the ones past their so-called usefulness, because it reflects your own. You see your end in their wrinkled hands. Their slow steps unsettle you. Their silence threatens the noise you've built your meaning around. The words hovered. You mistake youth for control. But time is not something you hold. It holds you. And one day, if God is kind, you will live long enough to realize that relevance is the cheapest form of immortality. The audience did not move. The stillness was no longer tension, it was reverence. A silence that acknowledged the presence of something higher than intellect, something older than pride. Julian's lips parted, as if to object, but no words came. The hand that once held his pen like a sword now rested limply against his chair. The Pope turned his gaze toward the watching world, toward the invisible millions behind the cameras, behind the screens, some in hospital beds, some on park benches, some in quiet kitchens where no one had called in weeks. Legacy, he said, is not built in headlines. It is carved in the prayers no one hears. In the grandchildren who remember how you hugged them, not what you owned. In the nights you cried alone, and still rose to bless others in the morning. Julian closed his notebook. He did it slowly, not for show, but as if the questions inside no longer mattered. Pope Leo looked back at him. I do not rebuke you, he said softly. I pity the fear that taught you to measure value by noise. You speak boldly now. But when silence comes for you, as it comes for all of us, you will want to be remembered for the souls you warmed, not the arguments you won. A tear streaked down the cheek of a female journalist in the second row. A cameraman lowered his rig to wipe his eyes. Even among the staff, murmurs were replaced with stillness, raw, stunned, unsettled. Julian swallowed, hard. But Pope Leo offered no triumph, no victory. Only truth. And it hung there. Not as condemnation, but as invitation. The world mocks what it doesn't understand. But if something in your chest understands this, even faintly, subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory. Because silence doesn't mean ignorance. Sometimes it means recognition. And if you still don't believe, if you still need to push back, then we're ready to hear your excuses in the comments. All of them. Pope Leo remained standing, but his eyes no longer held Julian. His gaze now passed through the walls, through the cameras, through the artificial lights, toward the silent corners of hospital wards, toward living rooms where old men sat in recliners staring at muted televisions, toward balconies where widowed women watered plants that had outlived their husbands. His voice, still steady, dropped into something deeper, pastoral, human, sacred. This moment is not about him, the Pope said quietly, and it was never about me. It is about you. He paused, not for drama, but for space. Space for the listener to realize they were no longer a spectator, but the subject. You who have seen more funerals than weddings. You whose joints ache before you rise. You who wonder if the world has moved on without you. Listen to me. His hand pressed gently over his heart. If you are still breathing, you are still becoming. The sentence did not shout. It did not try to convince. It simply stood there, like an open gate waiting to be walked through. You are not behind, he said. You are not late. You are not forgotten. You are not finished. He looked into the camera now, not as a leader, but as a witness. I have watched mothers outlive their children and still choose to bless others. I have met widowers who, instead of giving up, learned to make soup for the homeless. I have seen former politicians sweep church floors, and found more dignity in their broom than in their policies. The words were not for applause. They were for the soul. And they reached it. You are not useful because of what you do. You are holy because of who you are. And even if your hands tremble, they can still hold someone. Even if your voice cracks, it can still pray. The camera light glowed silently, blinking its red signal to millions around the world. And yet it felt like the Pope was speaking to one person, one widow, one grandfather, one exhausted nurse turning 72 tomorrow who had begun to believe maybe this was all just winding down. He took a breath. This world does not need more noise. It needs more wisdom. It does not need more youth, it needs more memory. It needs those who have lost and still love. Who have failed and still forgive. Who have nothing new to prove, but everything old to pass on. He let those words sit. Not rush past. Just sit. And if that is you, then rise. Not with your legs, but with your heart. God is not done with you. And we are not done needing you. There's someone over 65 who needs to hear this. Someone who's been feeling invisible, discarded, expired. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory so you don't forget to share it with them. Because if you scroll past this and let them keep believing their time has passed, what does that say about your heart? One room. One question. One truth. The confrontation that was meant to dismantle a legacy had, instead, revealed one. Not by force. Not through a clever defense. But through a stillness so full of history, pain, and mercy that even the sharpest voice in the room grew quiet in its presence. It began with a challenge: why tell the aging that their life still matters? It ended with an answer not spoken in argument, but in testimony. In the memory of dying men who blessed nurses with their final breath. In the hands of widows who kept serving even after the world stopped thanking them. In the voice of a pope who no longer needed to be believed, because he had lived too long not to be. What would you have said if you were in that room? Would you have nodded with Julian, applauding the logic of decline and quiet exits? Or would you have wept in silence, realizing that the very breath you still carry is not a mistake, but a mission? Would you have sat on the fence, unsure whether to believe in purpose, or too proud to admit you need it? This space is open to you now. Not to perform. Not to argue. But to reflect. Drop your thoughts in the comments, gently, honestly, with the weight of everything this story stirred in you. And not just for yourself. For your father. Your aunt. Your neighbor. The woman next door who hasn't had a visitor in 3 years. Speak on their behalf if they no longer know how. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. May we learn to honor what still breathes instead of rushing to bury it in irrelevance. May we remember that a soul is never obsolete. And that calling, unlike memory, does not fade with age. If you've watched until now, something moved you. Maybe it was a sentence. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe it was the sound of your own heartbeat, quietly agreeing with everything you tried to ignore. Subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. Or tell us in the comments what's still holding you back. And remember, silence, too, is an answer.